I'm Algenon Cash, and you're locked in. Welcome back. I've got another great episode lined up for you tonight. I appreciate everyone for joining us and supporting the Locked In Show. And I think you're going to really enjoy the guest that I've lined up for you tonight. I've got Mitch Kokai, who is a Senior Political Analyst with the John Locke Foundation. And we're going to be talking about voter ID. We'll be recapping the election cycle here in North Carolina, as well as talking about the newbie race, which I think a lot of people are talking about around the state, and hoping, if you're a conservative, you're hoping that may end some of the judicial activism that we've been seeing in the state of North Carolina over the last several years. But before we get started, I always like to let you know who is supporting the show, because whoever's supporting the show, if you enjoy the show, then you need to go support them. And Angela Harriet over at Keller Williams is a big sponsor of the show. If you're thinking about buying or selling a home, I want you to consider Angela Harriet at Keller Williams. And it's the holiday season. And so Angela Harriet is giving away a holiday meal for up to 6 people. She's partnering with J&S Cafeteria over in High Point, 5835 Samet Drive in High Point. All you need to do is go to the Facebook page. You'll see the message. You text free meal to the number that they give you, and you'll be automatically entered to win a free holiday meal next week for up to 6 people. And again, that's Angela Harriet at Keller Williams. And if you want to support the show, all you need to do is reach out to me. We've got a myriad of ways for you to support the Locked In Show, whether you want to be a sponsor, a contributor, or if you even want to come on the show. Certainly let me know, because obviously we're spending a lot of great time trying to pull together good content for the audience. And obviously that we need your support to be able to do that. One way that you can support us like right away is there's a little button on there. It says like. You can click like, you can share this conversation with a friend, and definitely make sure you go over to our YouTube channel. Search Locked In with Algenon Cash on YouTube and become a subscriber. That way you get notifications anytime we do new shows. You'll automatically know about it. And I've got some other good news. I heard today we are really super close. I know y'all have gotten tired of me talking about the podcast that's coming very, very soon. You're probably like, very soon. I've been saying very soon for like 3 weeks, but it is very, very soon. I actually got to see a preview of the site today. We are working over the next couple of days to get everything uploaded to Apple and Spotify and all the various platforms that are out there. So I do think by week's end, we'll have the Locked In podcast up and running. So that way you can take the show wherever you go. You can listen in your office, listen in the car, or obviously broadcast it from that little tiny device that you have in your pocket. Again, tonight, I've got Mitch Kokai, who's a Senior Political Analyst at the John Locke Foundation. And the last time I saw Mitch, who I've actually met through a leadership program that I went through that was sponsored by the Locke Foundation, which is the E.A. Morris Leadership Development Program. I was a fellow there, and also got to know Mitch when I was with the North Carolina Institute of Political Leadership. And Mitch probably doesn't remember this, but the last time I saw him, he was doing a mock interview of me, trying to get me ready for radio. And so I'm so honored to be in a position tonight that I get a chance to interview him. I think my audience is going to get a lot of value from the conversation. Mitch, how are you, man? I appreciate you locking in with us tonight. How you been doing?
I've been doing great. I didn't realize that was the last time that I saw you, but I do remember doing the interview with you as part of the Institute of Political Leadership. And a couple of things before we get into the heart of this discussion. First of all, you mentioned E.A. Morris, and I'm glad you did, because the application process is taking place for E.A. Morris right now. So if there are young adults out there, sort of early career people, who would like to learn a little bit more about leadership, learning about some of the economic principles that can help them, how to work as a leadership with people of different skill sets, and becoming and also making some great contacts. They can fill out some of the information by going to johnlocke.org and applying for that. The second thing I have to mention is, as someone who works at the John Locke Foundation, I've got to look at the title of your show and say, hey, how did we not get that title? You jumped the gun on us getting locked in. That's a great title.
Well, hey, we need all the sponsors and support that we can get. So we have no problem with the John Locke Foundation signing on to the Locked In show. So we need that. We need to have that conversation. But well, obviously I've seen you since the program, but the last time I actually had some interaction with you was back when you were training me on how to do radio. And so tonight will be fun. I'm really looking forward to our conversation. And for those that just listened to the pitch about the EA Morris program, it is a phenomenal program, well structured. The Locke Foundation does a heck of a job hosting it. I'm not sure how you're doing it now in the COVID environment, but when we went through it, we got to go all around the state to some really interesting, cool places. You learn more about the state of North Carolina, but even more importantly, you're in a room full of other leaders who might often not agree with you. And it really teaches you about communication and leadership development and how to build relationships with people that may not agree with you, may not look like you. And so it's a very diverse program. We had BJ Murphy on yesterday, and BJ just acquired the North Carolina Political News Network. He's also the publisher for News, and he's the CEO of Magic Mile Media. Go check out that conversation. But for my audience, the way I met BJ was in the EA Morris program. And so BJ and I've continued to be really close friends, but that relationship started in the program that Mitch just described. So Mitch, did you give the website where they can go actually apply for the program?
Don't know if I mentioned it, but if I did not, it is at johnlocke.org. And once you get to johnlocke.org, what you would want to do is search for the EA Morris Fellowship, and you'll find all the information there. The application process is taking place right now.
Well, Mitch, I know you're someone that is active all over North Carolina. You follow North Carolina politics very closely. You're a regular contributor to the Carolina Journal, which is the publication that the John Locke Foundation produces. And I encourage my audience to go find that as well. And, one of the things that I really want to get into tonight, we're just now winding through election 2020. For some people, it's not over yet. Despite the fact the Electoral College has spoken and so many certifications have happened, for some people, the election process is still ongoing. And one of the reasons that many people have been frustrated with the process was the allegations of electoral fraud, people being able to vote that shouldn't have been able to vote, and all these things that people feel like went on around the country. And one thing that I was paying close attention to is the voter ID law that was proposed here in North Carolina. And just to give my audience a little bit of context on it, back in 2013, Republican lawmakers included a voter ID requirement in a package of election reforms. The 2013 law combined a photo ID requirement with other provisions. It restricted days and hours for early voting. It eliminated same-day voting registration, and it blocked people from voting outside their designated precincts. It ended pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds, but IDs were checked at the polls during only the 2016 primary elections before a federal court rejected most of the provisions of that 2013 law as unconstitutional, saying they were aimed at reducing the number of minority voters. In December 2019, just a year ago, U.S. District Court Judge Loretta Biggs ruled that the state could not implement the voter ID requirement and said it must stop any communications to the public that say a photo ID will be required for all 2020 elections. But just recently, in this month, just a few weeks ago, a 3-judge panel of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Fourth Circuit unanimously reversed the lower court decision to enjoin North Carolina's voter ID law in constitutional amendment. The ruling means North Carolina will rejoin the majority of states in having some form of a voter ID law. More than 30 states require some form of voter ID. That just gives you a little bit of context. Mitch, I guess just to start with the basics, especially for my audience that may not know much about what happened. Is it constitutional to have a voter ID law here in North Carolina?
Well, we think it is, but I have to add a little bit of extra context, and that is that as you just mentioned, the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals overruled the district court that said that the voter ID law was unconstitutional. It said, no, we can move forward with a voter ID in North Carolina. But that's just one of the lawsuits that's been challenging voter ID. That's in the federal court. There's also a state lawsuit in which voter ID has been blocked, and that is still moving through the court system at this point. So even though the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals just unanimously ruled that voter ID could move forward in North Carolina, that doesn't mean we're going to have voter IDs for the next round of elections. We still have to have a resolution of the state court process. So the answer to your question in short form is we don't know yet. The federal courts have said yes, state courts still unresolved. At this point, voter ID is blocked. I also want to give a little bit more background because you gave a great description of what has happened, but there are a few more details that might help people and might give people a reminder of the role that they have played in this process. That law in 2013 came out shortly after a U.S. Supreme Court ruling called Shelby that dealt with some of the long-standing election laws. And once that ruling came out, North Carolina's General Assembly came out with that large package of election changes that you mentioned, had voter ID and the same-day registration and pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds. When that law was passed and opponents sued, the law eventually got to a 3-judge panel that struck it down, and the concern that was used was that it was racially discriminatory, that if you put all of those changes together, they had a disproportionate impact on African-American voters. And you might have heard the words almost surgical precision. That was in that court ruling that said that these changes targeted African-Americans with almost surgical precision. And ever since that ruling, we've heard that phrase come back again as describing changes in election law in North Carolina. Well, after that ruling came out, voter ID was defeated. Lawmakers who still wanted to see voter ID came back and said, look, we want to have a voter ID law, but let's let the people decide this. Let's actually put a constitutional amendment on the ballot and let voters of North Carolina decide whether they want to have a voter ID requirement in the state constitution. You might remember in 2018, this was one of 6 amendments that were on the ballot. There were a lot of constitutional amendments that year, certainly more than most years. 4 of the 6 amendments passed, including voter ID, with, I believe it was somewhere around 55% of the vote. The polling had even more support for voter ID, but there was a concerted campaign among Democrats to vote against all 6 amendments. They said, even if you like some of these, some of them are really bad, just vote against all 6. So the voter ID amendment vote was probably a little bit depressed from where it would have been had it just been the only item that was on the ballot. But still, a significant majority of North Carolina voters decided, yes, we want voter ID. We think about this issue so strongly that we want to put it in the state constitution. So shortly after that amendment was passed, the General Assembly came back, passed a law to implement the voter ID, and it was very open in terms of the types of IDs that could be used. Most people think driver's license, but you could also have, passport, state government IDs, college IDs were included in it. And basically, there was also another provision that said, if you don't have an ID, the state government's going to provide one for you for free. You can get it. You don't have to pay anything for it. And what's more, if you can't get to a government office to get an ID, you can go to the polling place and sign an affidavit that said you had a reasonable impediment that blocked you from getting ID. So basically, anyone who was eligible to vote was going to be able to vote, even if they didn't have an ID. Still, despite that being passed, state and federal court lawsuits challenged the voter ID requirement. As we've just talked about, Judge Loretta Biggs threw out the voter ID at the federal level, but the 3-judge Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals panel said, no, look at this law. Nothing about it is discriminatory against anyone. Most people are going to have a driver's license. Others will have other forms of ID. And if for some reason you just can't get an ID, you can sign a form saying that there was a reasonable impediment blocking you from getting one. So in terms of the feds, the federal government, voter ID is fine. More than 30 other states already have an ID. The U.S. Supreme Court has in the past with Indiana's voter ID said it's constitutional. So we just have to wait for the resolution of the state court case.
For many of my audience, it may be shocking that you don't have to currently show an ID to go vote. I think so many people will just naturally assume that's something that you have to do to go vote, just like you do when you go just about anywhere else. When you go to the bank, when you book a hotel, when you do any of these kind of routine things. Right now in our state, we use more of an honor system. How do you think that impacts election integrity?
Well, I think it gives people some concerns. I don't want to suggest that there is widespread voter fraud in North Carolina. I mean, we have seen cases here and there. We know that there was an entire election thrown out in the 9th Congressional District in 2018 because of some shenanigans going on with ballot harvesting. So to say that there's no voter fraud obviously is not true, but I don't want to suggest that there are thousands upon thousands of people who are engaging in voter impersonation fraud. That's probably not true. There probably are some cases that don't get caught, but I do think it gives people pause, especially if, as you suggested, if they've come from another state, one of the vast majority of states that require a voter ID. If they come to North Carolina, go to the polls, pull out their driver's license, and then the poll worker tells them, no, we don't need an ID. All I need is your name and your address. That gives people some concerns that they say, wait a minute, I need an ID to get on a plane. I need an ID to buy some Sudafed. I mean, I need an ID to do many other things. But for this voting, which is so important, I don't need an ID. Now, I'll give you the counter argument. The counter argument from those who have complained about voter ID is this is a right that is so fundamental, so important, more important than getting on a plane or going into a government building or doing these other things, that you shouldn't burden people with having to have an ID. And they also argue, as we suggested a little bit earlier, that because if you look at various populations, that minority populations might be a little less likely to have an ID, that having this type of requirement is an extra burden on them. And because voting is such a fundamental right, you can't have a burden that will disproportionately impact a minority or other protected group. And so you can't have a voter ID. That's the argument against it. But we have seen that courts have said, look, there is a balancing act here. You don't want to overly burden someone who has the right to vote from being able to cast that ballot like everyone else. But election integrity is important, and voter ID is something that helps protect election integrity. So as we just said, the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals looked at this case, and unanimously, 2 judges appointed by President Donald Trump, 1 appointed by previous President Barack Obama, all 3 of them agreed North Carolina's law on its face was not unconstitutional, and that North Carolina should be able to move forward with voter ID. And one can hope that the state courts will reach the same type of conclusion.
Some of the voting right advocacy groups like ACLU and many others out there says that the data shows that most North Carolina citizens that are most likely to lack a government issued ID are Black and brown. You mentioned having driver's license and passports and so forth. We may not have voter fraud, but what about voter suppression? I mean, does voter ID lead to suppressing votes?
That's one of the arguments against voter ID, is that it does, that by requiring people to have a voter ID, if you don't have an ID, that's going to make you less likely to vote. And if you look at the percentages, and the percentages of folks who don't have an ID are higher among minority communities or protected groups, that could be seen as a voter suppression tool. Certainly some judges have looked at it that way. The court that threw out North Carolina's voter law from 2013, that was basically their argument, that the various changes, voter ID plus these other things like not allowing people to vote outside their precinct, not allowing same-day voter registration, shortening the days and hours of early voting, all of those things were seen to have a disproportionate impact on African Americans. And that's why one judge wrote, now famously, that the changes seem to target African Americans with almost surgical precision. So that is an argument, but you have to have, if you're going to then proceed with something like voter ID, you have to have some safeguards in place to ensure that people who are eligible to vote and who should be able to cast a ballot don't have any major impediment. That's why North Carolina's voter ID law, if you compare it to some of the others in other states, it was much less restrictive. In fact, some of the people who were real advocates of voter ID looked at North Carolina's law and said, wait a minute, this just isn't strict enough. It should be a driver's license, passport, maybe a state government ID, but many of these other things that have been counted as a possible ID, they aren't strict enough. And so there was some pushback among the people who were zealots is probably a little strong word, but really strong advocates for voter ID. There was some pushback from them about the types of IDs that would be counted. I mean, and as I mentioned earlier, one of the things that really comes across that people don't seem to know but should is that part of the law said you can go, if you don't have a voter ID, but you are registered to vote, you can go to the polling place and sign an affidavit that says, I had a reasonable impediment that blocked me from being able to get a voter ID. You'll still be able to cast a ballot. So voter suppression is an argument that's made against voter ID, but I think almost all of the elements of North Carolina's law made it possible for anyone who is a legal voter to go and vote. We hope they have voter ID. And of course, for most everyone, it's going to be a driver's license. Most everyone's going to have a driver's license. Some people don't. They'll be able to cover their bases with other IDs. They can get an ID from the government for free if they don't have one and can't afford one. So a lot of the objections to voter ID were addressed in that law that was passed after the 2018 amendment. And remember, a majority of North Carolina voters, including a majority of Democratic voters, independent voters, unaffiliated voters, Republican voters, majorities of all those groups, maybe the Democrats not so much. I think it was still a majority of Democrats, but don't quote me on that. I think they all said yes to voter ID.
If you're just now joining us, you are locked in. I'm Algenon Cash. The other voice that you hear with me tonight is Mitch Kokai, who's a senior political analyst with the think tank, the John Locke Foundation, based out of Raleigh. And we're talking about voter ID and whether or not we might see that mandate get put in place by North Carolina lawmakers here in our state. You know, Mitch, you talked about the fact that there's more than 30 other states that are currently requiring an ID to go vote. There's probably been over 10 years since the United States Supreme Court ruled in Crawford versus Marion County Election Board, which is the Indiana law that you stated. And they actually said that provision did not violate the United States Constitution. 6 of the 9 justices agreed with that outcome, and that included some liberal members of the court that also agreed. So if there's 30 other states that are doing it and they're not adversely impacting African American and minority voters, why can't we do it here in North Carolina?
Yeah, it's a good question. And in fact, I think the justice who wrote the opinion was one of the liberals, John Paul Stevens. And John Paul Stevens had made his way in Chicago politics. So I think he was very, very aware of how voter fraud can work. And that was one of the reasons why I think that he was one of the people who supported it and in fact wrote that opinion. Yeah, voter ID has worked fine in other states. We have not seen it as an impediment. I think the main reason why it's being attacked in North Carolina is that opponents of voter ID just don't want to see it enacted anywhere else. Even if the program were identical to voter ID programs that are in place and that have worked without incident in other states, they're just going to fight it tooth and nail. They're going to try to find courts that will support them in their efforts to keep voter ID out. One of the nice developments is the fact now that a unanimous 3-judge panel of the 4th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals has looked at this issue and said, look, North Carolina's law, nothing inherently about it on its face would make it unconstitutional. And when they looked at Judge Loretta Biggs' earlier ruling that threw the voter ID out, they really gave her some scathing reviews and said there were fundamental flaws in her reasoning that really tainted the entire ruling. And basically, it sort of slapped back on this idea that voter ID could not be put forward in a way that was constitutional. Going back to the ruling that threw out that original election law from 2013, one of the things that interested me was there was a trial about this law. And this is the law that had voter ID, the same day registration, early voting. There was a trial before Judge Thomas Schroeder in I believe it was sitting in Winston-Salem. He held weeks of hearings, heard from, I believe it was 120 or so different witnesses, including 20 or so election experts, came out with a ruling that was almost 500 pages long. He said voter ID and the entire law were fine. What happened then is when the case was appealed, the 3-judge panel basically said, well, thank you, district court judge, and thank you for your 485-page ruling. We're just going to set all of the facts that you found aside, and we're going to look at North Carolina's history. And of course, you know, Algenon, North Carolina does have a bad history, not only the whole legacy of slavery going up to the Civil War, but then the whole Jim Crow era of purposely trying to block African Americans from voting. That is 100% true. That is part of our history. It's a very sad part of our history. But basically, the 3-judge panel said at that time, you got to look at the history, and there's been a history of trying to suppress votes. So that must be what Republican legislators were trying to do now. Even if the district court judge couldn't find any proof of that, that must be why they're pursuing these measures. And a lot of the critics of voter ID, that's their main argument. There's a history of trying to suppress the vote, so that must be what lies behind voter ID, even if there's no proof of it. And even if you look at the actual law and say, nothing about this is going to block a legal voter from voting when he or she wants.
You know, Michael Owens is out there. He's a loyal follower and listener of the show. And he says, I sat in the courtroom for that trial. He's based here in Winston-Salem. So I think he was there for that. I do want to switch gears a little bit before I run out of time. I got a couple of just questions about the election cycle we just went through here in North Carolina. Just over this past weekend, Chief Justice Sherry Beasley did concede to Paul Newby. And so it does look like Republicans picked up maybe 8, I think, appellate court judicial races. And then obviously we're going to see Republicans enlarge their presence on the state Supreme Court to now 3 seats, 3 out of the 7. There's been a lot of complaints from conservatives around the state over the past several years about judicial activism. With Newby becoming Chief Justice, what impact do you think that may have to some of the judicial activism allegations that we've heard over the last several years?
There's going to be an interesting impact. I've actually been looking very closely at this because with the 3 wins that Republicans got in the Supreme Court races, they're still going to be in a minority on the court. Going into the election, Democrats held a 6-1 majority. Paul Newby was the only Republican. Now there will be a 4-3 Democratic majority with Newby joined by Tamara Beringer and Phil Berger Jr. as the 2 new justices. The last time the Democrats held a 4-3 majority on this court was not that long ago. It was 2017 and 2018. And if you look over the course of that time frame, there were about 155 opinions issued by the North Carolina Supreme Court. And you might think, oh, there were a bunch of 4-3 rulings with the Democrats in the majority. No, about 80% of the rulings were unanimous. A lot of these cases have nothing to do with politics. They're dealing with areas of the law that most of us who aren't lawyers wouldn't care much about one way or the other. There were only about 13 of the 155 cases that led to 4-3 splits. And you might think, oh, well, they were all the Democrats on one side, the Republicans on the other. No, of the 155 cases, there were exactly 3 in which Democrats ruled one way, Republicans ruled the other. Of the other, among the other 10 4-3 splits, I think 7 of them were the 3 Republicans and 1 Democrat. because they agreed on legal reasoning on some issues, including some very consequential issues. So my suspicion is that with this very closely divided court, you're going to see a lot less of what looks like partisan rulings and more rulings based on different legal reasoning on particular areas of the law. Now, what will it be interesting to see is if a very political subject gets to the Supreme Court, what will happen? Because one of the three cases in which the court during that 4-3 Democratic majority did rule with Democrats on one side and Republicans on the other was a case called Cooper v. Berger that dealt with the potential changes to the state elections board. That ruling came out. The Democrats said, no, Republicans, you can't change the election board. Republicans said, yes, you can. So that actually did end up being kind of a partisan ruling. But I think we're going to see a little bit less of that. Remember, the other thing that's important to note, Paul Newby is not just the Chief Justice of the court, so one vote on that court. He also runs the court system now. Sherry Beasley has been running the court system. Paul Newby will be running the court system. He will appoint the chief judge of the State Court of Appeals. He will appoint the chief administrative law judge. And so he will have a major impact on how courts are run in North Carolina.
You mentioned all these various cases where they're not even partisan in nature. I mean, Mitch, should judicial races even be partisan, or should they be nonpartisan?
That's a very good question. And that's something that we at the John Locke Foundation have been wrestling with for a long time. I think the situation that we have now is better than what we had 10, 12 years ago. And that was kind of the worst of both worlds, is that you had elections for judges, but you had no party labels, and people didn't really have any way of determining who was who believed what, because judges, when they run for office, can't tell you a whole lot about their political views, because it might then affect the way that they would rule on a case, and they might have to recuse themselves. So basically, you got a lot of boilerplate language about, I like the Constitution and I think we should follow the Constitution, but you didn't really get a sense of how the person was going to rule on a case. So if you're going to have elections, having the party labels is a very important piece of information, but that doesn't necessarily mean you have to have elections. You could have appointed judges. And one of the things that several years ago, and we haven't revisited this lately, but basically at the Locke Foundation some years back when we were still with nonpartisan elections, we said, basically you should either have partisan elections or an appointment process that's similar to the federal government. The governor or the legislature would get to appoint someone, and then there would be a check on it. So if the governor gets to make the appointment, perhaps you give the Senate confirmation process, just like we have with the federal government. So if you're going to have an election, having a party label is something that's helpful to give people at least an extra piece of information just beyond a name, just so they're not voting for someone because their name sounds like a model or a NASCAR driver. We've had that before. And that's something to keep in mind. But I would be very open for a discussion about appointing judges as well, as long as there's a good check on the process and it's not just the governor doing it.
Many have told me that if I ever decide to run for office, I stand a great chance of winning with the last name Cash. I don't know if that's true or not, but so many people want Cash. Maybe they would vote for Cash if I was on the ballot.
Okay, Algenon, if you run, have it be Algenon, I'm going to give you Cash.
Yeah,
make your middle name. Your middle name will be I'm going to give you Cash.
It'll remind me one of them high school elections. But Republicans did have a great night on November 3rd here in North Carolina. We just talked about Chief Paul Newby becoming the new Chief Justice, all the judicial races that Republicans won. They did very good up and down the ticket. But there was one Republican that didn't fare so well, and that was Dan Forrest. I got to ask you before we get ready to go, what happened to Dan in the governor's race?
Well, I think this was a very interesting race in that it really seemed to turn on COVID-19 policy. I think a lot of the other races tended to be on ideology, and Republicans fared slightly better. If you looked at the races where people didn't know much about one candidate or the other. The statewide races seem to go about 51% Republican, 49% Democrat, or thereabouts. If there was an incumbent Democrat, that gave them some advantage and they did a little bit better. Incumbent Republicans might do a little bit better on their end because of name advantage. But the governor's race really seemed to be, in large respects, about handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. And Roy Cooper, whose approval rating on handling of the COVID-19 pandemic was as high as 70% back in April, that approval rating had fallen, but people still had a generally good sense of what he was doing to deal with COVID-19, whereas Dan Forest, who would have liked to have been talking about things like building jobs, increasing school choice, doing some of the things that are conservative principles, a lot of people looked at him as the guy who wouldn't wear a mask and just seemed to be on a very different page on how to deal with the pandemic. Also, another thing that hurt Dan Forest is that his campaigns in the past have been based so much on grassroots and getting out and knocking on doors and having people getting together and doing a lot of the boots on the ground things that just weren't possible during this very strange election year when a lot of people are staying indoors. So I think that more than any other election turned into a COVID-19 race, and there were enough people who liked what Roy Cooper had to say and what he was doing about COVID-19, even though there were many people who didn't, but enough people liked what he was doing on that front that really helped him.
No, I agree with you. We actually had John Hood on, who is the former CEO of the John Locke Foundation. He's now the president and CEO over at the John William Pope Foundation. And we had John on right after the election, I think the day after, and we did an election analysis. If you want to go back and watch that, that interview is available on our YouTube channel. It's available on the Facebook page. And John shares a lot of great insight. We really broke down a lot of races all the way from Trump down to many of the North Carolina races. And I totally agree with your assessment as well, Mitch. Here's the real burning question on most of my audience's mind right now. Is that your personal library behind you, or are you at the John Locke Foundation tonight?
I'm at the Locke Foundation right now. I wanted to have our library behind me and put on some nice lights. Plus, I put in a special microphone so we'd sound a little bit better, because you got to have good sound if you're going to be locked in with Algenon Cash.
Well, I appreciate that. And real quick, the John Locke Foundation just merged with the North Carolina Civitas Institute. What does that mean for North Carolina conservatives?
I think it's going to be great news for North Carolina conservatives, because you're taking two premier groups that have worked together well in the past, but sometimes have been duplicating efforts. Civitas obviously does a lot with polling. The Locke Foundation does a lot with research and white papers and looking into the academics of an issue. Civitas has been more doing sort of boots on the ground activism. I think putting the two together will make sure that resources get spent in the best way possible to help put forward the message of free markets and limited government. Plus, we've got a couple of great leaders. For people who have not met her yet, they'll want to check out the Locke Foundation's CEO, Amy O. Cook, who uses the nickname the Right AOC to contrast her with the other AOC, the one from New York. And she has a weekly video called The Right AOC on Point that's always interesting for a conservative audience. And then joining us now, he's been the president and CEO of the Civitas Institute, but he will become the president and chief strategy officer of the Locke Foundation, is Donald Bryson, who has a long history in the state. People who've been following conservative politics have probably know Donald as having worked for Parents for Educational Freedom in North Carolina on school choice. He was the state director of Americans for Prosperity that helped push a free market message. He's now been the head of the Civitas Institute, and he will now bring his skills and talents to be the president and chief strategy officer for this new group and take a role with the John Locke Foundation. So it's going to be great all the way around for the conservative movement here in North Carolina.
Well, I encourage my audience, go follow the John Locke Foundation. They're on Twitter, Facebook. You can sign up for their emails and their daily alerts. They do a really, really great job. The white papers that Mitch just spoke about, really great research. And make sure you go follow Mitch Kokai. He's working hard and keeping up with North Carolina politics. and he's producing a lot of commentary and op-eds and radio shows. Make sure you go subscribe to the Carolina Journal. So many resources out there for you if you're conservative and looking for some conservative political insight. Mitch, thank you for locking in with me tonight. We got to definitely, you're going to be on my regular list. We'll definitely get you back on to join us. Yeah,
I'd love to do it, Algenon. Always great to talk politics with you and to talk about E.A. Morris and the people we remember from back in your days. And if you ever want to revisit doing your IOPL interview, we'll plug it in again.
Hopefully, I've gotten a little better.
I think you were good at the time, but you've gone from here to so high that I'm out of the Zoom screen.
Well, I appreciate that. Again, thank you for locking in. And for my audience, as we get ready to wrap up here, just want to switch gears a little bit and go from state politics to federal and national. It does look like Congress is getting a little bit closer on a federal stimulus bill. A second round of stimulus checks is back on the table as congressional leadership closes in on a nearly $900 billion deal on emergency coronavirus relief. Though the amount of the direct payments will likely be cut in half from the initial ones doled out in the spring, the ones that came out in the spring were around $1,200. I'm hearing these might be more around $500 or $600. I also want to recognize Mackenzie Scott, former wife to Jeff Bezos, has donated just over $4 billion to 384 charitable organizations around the country, including many HBCUs right here in our backyard, like Winston-Salem State University, as well as North Carolina A&T. I'm actually working on a short live segment about this because I know so many of you all that loathe capitalism and you believe in redistribution of wealth. This is a great symbol of what happens with a lot of billionaires. When they amass their wealth, they typically give it all away. And so we need to make sure that we are not demonizing those people who do well in our society, because those are the people that oftentimes finance a lot of these charitable organizations. I used to serve on the Winston-Salem State University Foundation Board, and I can personally attest to a $30 million gift to that foundation is significant. It's the largest gift in history. And Ms. Scott has certainly changed the future course of not only Winston-Salem State University, but so many HBCUs and many other charitable organizations. So look out for that live segment. I'll be working on that. And then tomorrow, I've got John Louder locking in with me. John Louder is the president of the Piedmont Triad Apartment Association. We do have an eviction crisis that is looming. It's coming very fast unless Congress can figure out some kind of a deal. So John will be here to talk about what's going on with housing. And look for this week, I'll have an interview coming out with Lauren Desai, who is the owner of Aperture Cinema. We break down the top 10 Christmas movies that are must watch. You have to see them, and you can watch them right in the comfort of your own home. And so look for that coming out this week as well. Until next time, y'all stay locked in.